if the Romans were known for might, of course not solely for might, but they were known for might, the Persians were known for the arts. They were known for philosophy, they were known for poetry.
Philosophy as a discipline is that when it's coming from, as it comes from the Hellenic period, through the Greeks, into the Roman times, into the Muslim world essentially, throughout this formative period, up until Ibn Sīnā, although the idea of philosophy would be that it's a non-dogmatic approach to approaching the reality of things, but you do find dogma very much involved in that.
Is that people think this is when Aristotle is now fully in the... No. That's al-Kindī. Yeah, al-Kindī and his group of research fellows or translators, whatever you want to call them, they are the first people that translate the metaphysics.
Our refutation, which happens from the science of kalam, essentially our refutation becomes mawqūf upon and becomes reliant upon understanding philosophy itself.
The likes of Shaykh al-Akbar, al-Kashani, the likes of Sadruddin al-Qunavi, etc. They had some huge contributions as falsafah in and of itself.
You find that Fatḥullāh Shirāzi is this intellectual from the Persian world who essentially brings the ma'qulat tradition and this intellectual discourse of the rational sciences into what we know as the Indian subcontinent. Khwaja Qamaruddin as-Siyalawi, who's a great Akbarian Khairabādī scholar of the Chishti way, he was somebody who was huge on reviving the ma'qulat tradition of the Khairabādīs, his teachers.
Even in the subcontinent, you have people like Mullah Ahmad Rida Khan, has an independent work written in philosophy. He dies very late, don't forget. You have the likes of Pir Meherli Shah, al-Ghazālī, rahimahullah ta'ala, who writes extensively in philosophical discussion, particularly philosophical tasawwuf.
So let's start with Imam al-Ghazālī and work through this post-classical era until we get to the Khairabādīs themselves and see, now that we've understood their methodology in approaching the science, what are the important periods that exist here and who are the key players.
Alhamdu lil-mutawahhidi bijalalihi al-mutafarridi wa salatuhu dawman ala khayril anami Muhammadi.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Ahlan wa sahlan bikum jami'an. Welcoming everybody, inshallah, to this podcast, Sacred Roots with Khairabādī Institute. We're really excited today, inshallah. We have a wonderful conversation coming up about the development of hikmah, or traditional philosophy within the Islamic tradition. Alhamdulillah, with me is the founder of Khairabādī Institute, Maulana Shaykh Iqbal. Ahlan wa sahlan. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.
So alhamdulillah, we have this journey, inshallah, that we'll be embarking on together. And so I thought we'll put out some objectives, some of the themes that we want to cover, inshallah ta'ala. One of the things that we want to talk about today is not only the role, but also the entry of falsafah into the Islamic intellectual tradition. For those that may not be aware, of course, Islam has an intellectual tradition since its very inception. But where did formal philosophy enter into that? So that's one really important. And what does it represent? What type of philosophy is it? Does it have a place within the tradition? How was it looked upon by the scholars of the past? All of that's going to be very interesting and important. Also, in that light, is there a need for it? Was there a need then? Has there been a need historically? And is there a need today to have a level of understanding of philosophy? If so, what kind, how much, etc. Another thing that we want to talk about more specifically is going to be the famous Hidāyat al-Ḥikmah of al-Imām al-Jalil, al-Abharī, Afiruddin al-Abharī, who is known for many things and is an author of a whole host of different books, but perhaps in our tradition most famously known for two books, one in logic and one in hikmah. Today they're considered to be two different sciences. Were they historically? Again, this is all going to be, inshallah, part of the conversation and focusing on him, his book, its role, where it was studied, was it appreciated, the breakdown of the book, all of that, inshallah ta'ala, is going to be covered. Also, we're going to be looking at, again, more specifically, the role of hikmah in the Farangī Maḥall tradition, which is obviously the area that we primarily occupy ourselves with, that within the sort of In India in general, we can have a look at, but focusing primarily on the late 17th century, 18th centuries, and perhaps into the 19th centuries, and maybe even, if we're lucky, today, where we are with the role of hikmah in the traditional curricula and within the traditional madaris. And one of the last things that we're going to want to talk about perhaps is how it featured amongst the different empires. I mean, we can go into this in more detail, but you could arguably break down Islamic history into three main empires: the sort of Ottoman Empire, the Mughal Empire, and the Safavid Empire in Iran. And these three ruled for a long period of time, and they, geographically speaking, were the largest. And so what was the role of hikmah within the empires and within their madrasas? So that's the sort of main area and the main topics that we want to cover today, inshallah.
Yeah. And one of the major objectives of today's podcast, I think, should be to present a traditionalist take on falsafah or philosophy. There is a lot online, as you can see, with regards to philosophy in the Muslim world, philosophy in various Muslim empires, the development of philosophy and different philosophers in the Muslim world. I think our aim will be here to present a falsafah from a traditionalist perspective, how the ulama of Ahl Sunnati wal Jama'ah through the ages have viewed philosophy and how they have dealt with philosophy. So there's a lot of discussions that we want to go through today, inshallah azza wa jal. And I think a really good starting point would be to actually understand, define philosophy, falsafah or hikmah. So falsafah, hikmah, or philosophical activities, they could be classified as attempts to apprehend a conceptual understanding of the universe, but within a system. So if one were to think of philosophy as a science comprising a study of these systems, it would necessarily define philosophy as a study of systems, basically. So can we first start off by actually defining philosophy within a traditional context, a traditional definition of falsafah as viewed by the Ḥukamāʻ Islamiyin or as viewed by scholars throughout the Muslim world over the centuries?
Well, the traditional definition that's given of hikmah in our books, as you well know, is that it's an ilm, first and foremost. It is a science, it's a proper study. بِأَحْوَالِ الْمَوْجُودَاتِ. So we're studying what exists.
Right.
And then they'll say أَعْيَانًا كَانَتْ أَوْ مَعْقُولَاتٍ. So whether this existence is fil kharij, meaning extramental, or fil dhihn. Fi nafs al-amr, which is that objectively, as they are, without the projection of any one particular person's opinion, it is objectively the case, بحسب الطاقة البشرية, or as much as is humanly possible.
Right.
So to study what exists, both in the mind and external to the mind, as it is, as much as is humanly possible. That's the official definition given in the traditional works, medieval works of Arabic philosophy, of hikmah. And they would then break this type of hikmah, or this type of study of the mawjudat, into two broad categories. You'd have hikmah, which is nadhariyah, and hikmah, which is amaliyah. So practical sciences. As for nadhariyah, sort of reflective or rational, so to speak, this would comprise of three main areas: the ilahiyat, metaphysics, of riyadiyat, of mathematics with all of its sub-branches, and tabi'iyat, physics, the natural sciences. And for amaliyat, that would include things like siyasa, politics, tahdhib al-akhlaq, so morals or ethics. That would include things like the manzil, the tadbir al-manzil, which is like society,
like household
economics,
management or economics,
etc. All of that would be included within philosophy. Now, for somebody today, they may find that definition alien, but that is the medieval definition of philosophy.
Yeah, to such an extent that when you mentioned the riyadiyah, which is loosely could be translated as mathematics, which is a type of philosophy, that would have subcategories. So even music would be a type of philosophy. You'd have calculus, a type of philosophy. You would have astronomy would be a type of philosophy. To such an extent that even geometry would be a type of philosophy. So it's a very...
Astrology.
I mean, it's a very loose definition which incorporates a lot of subcategories that would today otherwise be seen as separate sciences.
Well, if you're studying all of the mawjudat
So, in other words, what we can say then is that philosophy is an inclusive, rational process aimed at knowing the nature of things and then expressing it, or expressing that result in a systematic way. So that's interesting, because if you look at the post-enlightened definition of philosophy, they say that philosophy, or they would define philosophy as a free exercise of reason, which is unencumbered by a specific outcome. So the objective of doing philosophy or doing falsafah, or engaging with this discipline which would be known as philosophy, would be not to arrive at a particular conclusion or a specific conclusion, but it's rather driven by principles that are preliminary, and is driven by methods which are not directed towards any particular outcome or any particular dogma, or not guided by any particular dogma. So therefore, philosophy, you'll have philosophy of mathematics, you'll have philosophy of politics, you'll have philosophy of language even, which is interesting, because one of the things you find is that the summary of that large definition, or that long definition of the post-enlightened understanding of philosophy, is essentially that there's a non-dogmatic approach in order to understand the things as they are. And that would be philosophy. But when philosophy entered into the Muslim world, generally speaking, it wasn't viewed as something non-dogmatic. They actually saw philosophy to be synonymous with for the most part, the Masha'i way, or peripatetic philosophy. They saw it not free of dogma. They actually, in the Muslim tradition, it was largely an Aristotelian enterprise. This entire work of, this entire subject of philosophy, and this is why then you find the Ishraqi or the Illuminationists who, respond to the broader understanding of philosophy, because they have a different view of what philosophy should be, because it's driven by dogma, which is quite interesting. So that's obviously a good understanding there of how ulama would have viewed philosophy in the Muslim world, that it's essentially ilm bi ahwal al-mawjudat fi nafs al-amr.
I mean, by the way, it wasn't always like that in the West, as in you had empiricist philosophers, you had materialist philosophers, you had rationalist philosophers. I mean, up until not so long ago, all of the famous philosophers that you hear about, they normally broadly would fit into one of these categories.
Interesting.
So they would, even if they're writing as an empiricist.
So although we're arguing, although the post-enlightened definition of philosophy will argue unbiased, but really there was
always going to be a bias, of course.
There are coming from
absolutely. For example, are you a hard determinist? Are you not? These are all conversations. If you look to speak to a lot of atheists today, when they're trying to push for example, evolution, they would say that we live in a world of hard determinism. So really, is anybody absolutely free of dogma? I don't think that's possible.
Fantastic. So the philosophy, or in Arabic falsafah, is said to have derived from the word faylasufan, which means muhibbul hikmah, or the one who loves wisdom. Hence why in the Muslim world, one of the names for philosophy itself was hikmah. This discipline then has, for the early part, been attributed to the Greeks, because they founded, formally founded the discipline of the subject. But this doesn't mean that it didn't exist independently away from a structured discipline earlier on, meaning the idea of philosophy, which is to know the things as they are. So let's briefly go through the different periods of Hellenic philosophy and classical philosophy, specifically in the Muslim world. So where do we start with that?
That's $1 million question. Where do you start with that? Sometimes they start with Pythagoras, for example. Maybe it comes down to the earliest author, where we have a written work. Because if you look at historiography in the Western Academy, they don't like the oral tradition. So for them, it's about, can you find a manuscript that's dated closely in the hand of either the author or his known scribe, or there's a whole study or way that they would deal with that. So I think perhaps from that perspective, but otherwise you've got the Stoics, you've got so many different groups. I mean, who knows? I mean, from the Islamic point of view, وَعَلَّمَ آدَمَ الْأَسْمَاءَ كُلَّهَا. You know, God taught Adam the names of all things. So ultimately, the study of wujud, of existence, has been there from the beginning. But in terms of the Hellenistic period, so let's say you could put a pin on, let's say, Pythagoras, and say, okay, we start from there. And then let's move on to history Socrates. Should he have actually existed? Because there's a myth about that, I don't know. And then history Plato, and then history Aristotle. And so now we've got this sort of this. I mean, what one could argue is that the two main styles of philosophy that have existed historically and into the Muslim world and into the Jewish tradition and into the Christian tradition and etc., that those two schools were argued, debated, studied most vigorously in terms of what was actually authored in this period. Was it studied before? Of course it was. But in terms of like where it really, in terms of the wada, you know, the actual coinage, it seems that it was happening most fundamentally here. And it's from here that it then moves out.
Because that's interesting, because you mentioned Aristotle, and he's actually, considered the founder or the muassis of the Falsafah Masha'iyya, or the peripatetic school. He's also known as Mu'allim Awwal, the first teacher when it comes to the science of logic as well. And we're definitely going to talk about him a little later on. But then we move into the Roman period. So what's happening in the Roman world? How are they treating philosophy, or how do they view philosophy?
Well, they had a problem at one point because of Christianity, actually. But the focus at that time was Syriac, was Hebrew. So they had their own tradition. They had their own system that was happening. But a lot of their problems with it came largely because of their issues with Christianity until they had accepted Christianity themselves.
Right, okay, interesting. And then we move into the formative period. You've got obviously, just for the
By the
viewers.
way, sorry,
Yeah?
if I may, I think I oversimplified that for just a minute. They had their own tradition, but people sometimes think that the Romans came and wiped it out. No, there was a damage that was done, but it didn't disappear. And the reason why I have to say that as a caveat, because of what you're going to say now, because you're going to want to talk about the Muslim tradition. And can I just put this right there in parenthetical clause, that the entry of philosophy into the Arabic tradition would have been impossible almost. Like, I'm talking about in terms of the norms of nature, impossible without the role played by Christian scholars, because their most earliest translators, and we'll talk more about that, were Christians. So the idea that they had no role in this, no, they had a huge role, particularly in Syria. So there was a huge role of Christians. But I mean, this isn't about that, but that's an interesting area for people to realize. Although it may have died down, but it was by no means finished.
That's interesting. Then we obviously come to the formative period. Now, just for the viewers, the formative period would be like the time up to Ibn Sīnā or Avicenna. It's known as the formative period. And then in that era, one of the important points for philosophy in that period is obviously Caliph Ma'mun and this whole translation process that takes place. Can you just give us a little bit of...
Yeah, I mean, it depends on where you want to put a pin in that history, because some people would start with the Mu'tazila, you know, and they would say, well, if you're talking about philosophy, the kalam is filled with philosophy. Although we would say the mutakallimun, but people could say it starts with the Mu'tazila, people could say it starts with the Murji'ah, people could say it starts with the Khawarij. You know, like, what is falsafa except debating an idea, right? Ultimately. So I think, I guess, people should understand that this is an oversimplification for the purpose of a podcast.
Of course, yeah.
Otherwise, there's a huge amount of detail and nuance there. But if what you mean is let's pick one historical moment that was significant, then yes, Khalifa Ma'mun from the Abbasid Khulafa is in a period where, and another thing people have to understand is that if the Romans were known for might, of course not solely for might, but they were known for might, the Persians were known for the arts. They were known for philosophy, they were known for poetry. They had huge interactions because of where they were geographically, huge interactions with Hinduism and Buddhism coming from Central Asia and India. And so there was a huge amount of, and remember, Hindu philosophy is probably one of the most ancient philosophies, and arguably one of the least studied. Buddhism has a huge philosophy. So there was a lot of philosophy that was entering into Persia historically from there. Then you have philosophy entering in from the Greeks. So you already have a very philosophical people anyway. So that explains the context of why Ma'mun was the way he was. Furthermore, these converts, these people, these children of, some of them are aristocrats. They're extremely well off and they are great patrons of the arts. Architecture. I mean, even if you remember when the city of Baghdad was built by his father or grandfather, I forget, he built it as like a traditional Greek city. He built it round, and there's a whole, so they were very interested in all of the arts. So that's a context. Bayt al-Hikmah didn't just fall out of the sky. Bayt al-Hikmah is built. Sahal is the name of the librarian, very famous scholar. This is primarily, before it's a translation project, is a book binding and preservation of texts as a library. So it was really just about them preserving knowledge and studying knowledge. Then what happens, along with many people that are very famous that were appointed in Bayt al-Hikmah, one of the most famous is Hunayn ibn Ishaq. Now that's a name that everyone, it's a household name for those that are studying this period. Because Hunayn ibn Ishaq is of Syrian origin, but he's from Iraq, and he is a Christian. And he, so can I correct the misconception here? The misconception is that people say he translated from the Greek to Arabic. That's not true. He translated from the Greek to Syriac.
That's right.
Which is a dialect of Aramaic, which was his language. So he translated into that language. That's what he was doing. Then it's other people, and from them his son. Interesting. Do you want to know what his son's name is? Ishaq ibn Hunayn. So he's Hunayn ibn Ishaq. He's Ishaq ibn Hunayn. He is the main person to translate, particularly works of logic. Is in the translation of Aristotle in terms of logic is him. His father actually was primarily translating Galen, medical works. Galen was famous for medical works. So he was translating books of medicine, but his son begins to translate more theological or philosophical works. So there's a whole team, but they're not alone in this. In fact, can I say one other misconception? Is that people think this is when Aristotle is now fully in the, no. That's al-Kindī. Yeah, al-Kindī and his group of research fellows or translators, whatever you want to call them, they are the first people that translate the metaphysics of Aristotle, which we'll get to later. So the reason why I mention this period, and I'm sure we'll get to al-Kindī, is that this was the first time properly where you have a place where an entire philosophy, because of their love for philosophy, is now being translated by means of Syriac into the Arabic language.
So it's interesting as well, because what you also find in his period is that it wasn't that before Khalifa Ma'mun there was no translation works or a translation of Greek works happening. It actually was happening, but you could understand Khalifa Ma'mun's period. Why you'll find it in the history books of philosophy in the Muslim world is because it was translation en masse, basically. So you actually find the House of Wisdom, he funds it, Bayt al-Hikmah, and then it's in that period when you had works on medicine and astronomy translated. So you had Euclid's Elements, Ptolemy's Al-Mujist, I think you pronounce it Al-Mujist, was translated in that period, and a number of Platonic dialogues as well were translated in that period. And 2 centuries after Khalifa Ma'mun, what you find is that the entire corpus of Greek medicine, natural philosophy and mathematical science has been basically rendered into the Arabic language. So that's why Khalifa Ma'mun from the Abbasid Khalifas is remembered in the history books of the formation of philosophy. But then we're coming on to Kindī now. So you did mention Kindī. So Kindī, he's an interesting figure, because what they say about him, and I use that word loosely, interesting figure, because what they say about him is that he begins to introduce the idea of the validity of philosophical investigation in and of itself, but independent of formal kalam. You touched on him introducing Aristotle into the Muslim world, and that's actually right, because you find that his circle, the Kindī circle, were very interested in Aristotelian works and Aristotelian philosophy in general, and you have them translating Plotinus, Proclus, and who are the two ancient Platonists. You find Kindī circle, heavily involved in translating those works, in forwarding, what you could say is Aristotelian philosophy. So that's Kindī. Then we come down to Fārābī. So Fārābī is also somebody who, you'll find in history books. Who's Fārābī? What's going on with him? And what's happening in the formative period with Fārābī for philosophy in the Muslim world?
Well, he's considered to be al-Mu'allim al-Thani.
Okay.
He's considered to be the second teacher in logic. He also writes a book called Ta'lim al-Thani. And he is, one of the things that makes Fārābī so important, amongst many, is that he is one of the big influences on Ibn Rushd. So Ibn Rushd, as we're going to, I'm sure, discuss at some point, he's very important. So al-Fārābī is hugely important in Ibn Rushd's understanding of Falsafah. So Ibn Rushd does some really important and interesting things in his lifetime, but that may not have now been possible without the likes of al-Fārābī. So al-Fārābī is very important, like al-Kindī, perhaps not as important, since al-Kindī is the introduction of a lot of this. Yeah, he's the introduction of this. He's the main translator. He's the main commentator, whereas al-Fārābī is the second teacher, because he's instrumental in disseminating that knowledge. So in that regard, he becomes very important. And so in the famous trio, al-Kindī, al-Fārābī, Ibn Sīnā, you can't make that jump between al-Kindī and the later philosophers without going through al-Fārābī.
It's interesting, because that's why he gets Mu'allim al-Thani, the second teacher, even though they jump from
people jump, yes,
Aristotle to Fārābī. Okay,
there's lots of detail on that, but I don't know if you know.
You did touch on the Mu'tazilites. So how did and we're going to talk about this a lot more later on, but with the Mu'tazilites, you did touch on them earlier, that they adopt philosophical principles very early on, and then they form their own kalam. And this is what's interesting, because a lot of the objections towards kalam, especially in the early period, is actually is Mu'tazili kalam, which is a type of kalam, right? It's a type of systematic way of defining your beliefs or giving evidence for your beliefs. So what's happening with the Mu'tazilites? Like how are they, to what extent did they adopt these philosophical principles into their kalam?
Well, they were not like a direct result of like the Hellenistic, school of philosophy or something like that. No. But what they did was they increased the role of reason. They held on to a very fundamental position of, or you could say a sort of Neoplatonic position of God being a simple essence. And as a result of that, they were forced to deny the sifat, the attributes of God. And so in that, in that regard, they sort of lean on that, in that tradition in that way. From another perspective, they were moralists. They believed that God had to be just. And so as a result, there are acts that we have agency over, that God, that it's entirely ours. And so we create our own acts, because they could never consider attributing, the creation of evil to God. So they were a moralist school. So those are essentially rationalist principles that they've adopted, and now they are squaring revelation with it. So in that sense, they were the first to philosophize about religion, even though they are not considered to be ḥukamāʼ. And there's a lot that could be said about them. They are extremely important. And what makes them so important is that because they were primarily focused on theological issues, there is a distinction between them and the ḥukamāʼ. So with Ibn Sīnā, although of course al-Ghazālī and others respond to him, al-Kindī, al-Fārābī, they're ḥukamāʼ, but the Mu'tazila were from the same people. Like for example, some of the early Mu'tazila, they were Hanafis and Shafi'is, mainly Hanafis, but some, like al-Qadi Abdul Jabbar is a Qadi in the Shafi'i school, who converts from being Ash'ari to being Mu'tazili. So, when you look at that, you think they were from the same family. you know. So I think that's why their activities were more devastating to the Muslims, first. Secondly, they were before many of the others. And thirdly, they were primarily focused on philosophizing about theology. And so that's one of the reasons why they become so important.
And then at the end of that trajectory of the formative period, we obviously come to Ibn Sīnā. Now what's interesting about Ibn Sīnā's period is that after Ibn Sīnā, philosophers in the Muslim world had a choice of either undoing Ibn Sīnā totally. This is how important he is in the world of philosophy, that either they undo him totally and they go back to the Hellenic periods of philosophy, or they take him as a new starting point. He's at the end of that trajectory of the formative period, and you find that they use him as a new starting point, the philosophers thereafter. But also the point I was making here is that he has a type of influence on the mutakallimin, or on the scholastic theology, in that they would, although they would criticize Ibn Sīnā, but they would borrow from him in terms of distinctions and distinctive terminologies that are found inside Kalam.
Fully. Wajib al-wujud.
That's right, yeah, exactly.
Like, it's the first thing that you learn. Can I say something on this, by the way?
Yeah.
A dalil for this is, before Avicenna, Ibn Sīnā, the commentary is on Aristotle, isn't it?
That's right.
After Ibn Sīnā, the commentary is on Ibn Sīnā.
Ibn Sīnā.
When al-Imām Fakhruddin al-Razi, rahimahullah, wants to write a commentary on philosophy, he's writing on the isharat of Ibn Sīnā. You see, and I think that's what's so important about this.
Very interesting. And then obviously he's got, he's also very famously known for his Shifa, which is basically...
Up until only some hundreds of years ago, that was still the main medical textbook, even in Latin.
Interesting. I mean, essentially that was an abridgment of Ta'lim al-Thani of al-Fārābī.
Do you know why he's also so important? He's so important because what he did was reworked Aristotle. There's a difference. You know, there's a difference when you do tawdīh of something, you do some tafsir on something, and there's another thing when you do tahdhīb of something. He did tahdhīb of it. He restructured it, he reworked it, he added it. Anything that there was a loose end, he tied it up. He completely reworked the whole system. So hence why would you go back? It's like, here's an example I'll give you. It's like, why would you go back and study the earliest works of fiqh, which are just a whole host of aqwal and positions, and not study the matan right at the end, which is the khulasa and lub of it all. All reworked, understood, muftā bihi, mu'tamad position right here.
Interesting.
So Ibn Sīnā is more important than people understand. This is why Imam al-Ghazālī, and I don't know if you want to talk about that at all or when, but this is why him focusing on Ibn Sīnā, one, is a proof of that the greatest scholar of the age, who's literally commissioned to deal with threats to a Sunni orthodoxy, is taking on Ibn Sīnā. And also the fact that it was Ibn Sīnā that he was taking on, he wasn't speaking about Aristotle, Plato. They were all fi dhiman.
Okay, that's interesting, because that shows Ibn Sīnā's influence in the discipline of philosophy, that essentially rebuttaling him is rebuttaling philosophy itself. One of the other works that he wrote was obviously the Isharat wa Tanbihat, and you get ʿAllāmah Fakhruddin al-Razi, rahimahullah, who actually writes a commentary on the work. There's no need to say that he's obviously going to be defending Sunni theology in his commentary. And Nasiruddin al-Tusi writes a response to the commentary of Fakhruddin al-Razi on Ibn Sīnā's Isharat. So essentially what we can say is that Ibn Sīnā's from the peripatetic school. He's known as being a Masha'i. This then takes us on to the different schools of philosophy that were formed. And before we go on to those different schools that were formed, I think what we can summarize up to now for the audience and those who are listening is that from the traditional definition of philosophy that we find in our books that are taught within our curriculums, essentially in Dars Nizami or within the Ottoman tradition, philosophy is a discipline in which you are researching mawjudat, those things that existentially exist or they exist in the mind. That's how you would define philosophy. But what you find with philosophy as a discipline is that when it's coming from, as it comes from the Hellenic period, through the Greeks, into the Roman times, into the Muslim world, essentially, throughout this formative period, up until Ibn Sīnā, although the idea of philosophy would be that it's a non-dogmatic approach to approaching the reality of things, but you do find dogma very much involved in that. You do find a bias very much involved in that, principles that that philosophers would have used in philosophizing. So what you do find is that exists also in the Muslim world, and this is why traditionally there would have been a problem with philosophy. People would have engaged with philosophy in a manner that would have been rebuttaling it, because although the idea was that you're studying unbiasedly, essentially you are coming from a context and you are coming from a dogma and a way of understanding these things that are in the kharij, or which existentially or exist, or which exist in the mind. So you do find with those early philosophers in the formative period, in the Hellenic period, that schools formed, schools of philosophy formed. There's schools that exist that have particular philosophies based upon their dogma. So we've got the early two, which are the Falsafah Masha'iyya and the Falsafah Ishraqiyya, the peripatetic school and the school of the Illuminationists. Essentially, then the Falsafah Masha'iyya, or the peripatetic school, the founder could be argued as Aristotle, and Ibn Sīnā is from the school of the peripatetics.
Well, it's Plato, Aristotle, ultimately, isn't it? That's what it is. You know, the famous picture, the painting, where you have, you have Plato pointing to the sky and Aristotle to the ground. Really, everything goes back to that. It's a different version of that. It's a commentary on that. It's a discussion on that. It's a different name for that. Broadly speaking,
you got the Falsafah Ishraqiyya, who are the Illuminationists. So the founder of that would be Plato, and obviously one of the big names in the Muslim world would have been Suhrawardi. Then essentially Imam Ghazālī rahimahullah comes, and he really he sheds light on this, the different schools of the philosophers, and he essentially divides them into three camps. And he says one of them are the Dahriyun, which are the materialists. You have the Tabi'iyun, who are essentially the natural philosophers. And with the natural philosophers, what's interesting about them is that although they do believe in God, but they are also considered deviants because they deny the Day of Judgment. And then you have the Ilahiyun, or the theologians. They are the late philosophers like Socrates and etc. So Imam Ghazālī actually divides them into three camps. What's interesting is that Falsafa Qadīma, or this old philosophy, is the foundation for Falsafa Jadīda. Falsafa Jadīda which is essentially born out of new philosophy, is essentially born out of this old philosophy. So like the modern sciences that we have today in universities, which we consider as sciences per se, actually are, like we earlier mentioned, they are types of philosophies, and they were actually born out of Falsafa Qadīma. Is there anything you want to add onto that about modern sciences and how their relationship is to philosophy in general?
Well, I think the first thing, as you mentioned, I won't say much on that, but there's nothing new. I've said this before. I think I said this in one of our earlier podcasts too. There is no new philosophy. It's just reworkings, rewordings, re-engagements, different ways of doing it. But the reason why I'm speaking in principles is because those principles remain the same. Like empiricism always existed. When you start Sharh al-Aqaid, and it begins with Khabar al-Sadiq, Aql, Ahwas Khamsa, Ahwas Salima, and Khabar Sadiq. Like, what is that except for rationalism, empiricism, and testimony? Like, these are just epistemology hasn't changed, nothing has changed. Certain positions, discussions, by and large, it's exactly the same.
Definitely. Like, meaning philosophy today in the modern world is based upon philosophy in the classical period. But also, what else the point that was making was that you actually find that old philosophy, new philosophy today, which is actually just the modern sciences that we have actually morphed out of this old philosophy that exists.
Absolutely. Of course, absolutely.
So that's interesting as well. Okay, then moving on. One of the other things that we wanted to discuss was, and this is quite an important topic to discuss, because before we actually engage in the post-classical tradition of philosophy, so we've looked at this formative period now, and we've got this post-classical period after Ibn Sīnā onwards. It's important first that we can discuss the legal ruling of engaging in falsafa. And then as an offshoot to this question, once we've understood the Shar'i hukam on Falsafah, let's talk about the benefits of engaging with philosophy itself or Falsafah itself. First of all, what are the different areas of philosophy in the sense that which ones correspond to the Sharia and which ones don't?
So the first thing with this is that there's three different ways that you can look at this. One is there's hikmah, philosophy, that will not correspond to the Sharia. And so in the Sharia, such philosophy is haram, meaning it's not considered to be acceptable. However, it's sometimes by some people studied, and even here some of the ulama have mentioned that it is wajib kifayatan for some of the ulama, and there are conditions for them which we'll talk about, for some of the scholars to learn that philosophy even if it is against the Sharia. Why? In the same way that in and of itself, Muslims have no interest in learning how to use military weapons, for example, in a Muslim country, let's say, yeah, or in the days of the Khilafah. But they would learn it in order to protect their borders, for example. In the same way, this type of hikmah is learnt in order to understand the argument of the interlocutor and to be able to provide adequate responses to that. I think any reasonable person, noting that when you live in a society where you have a mixture of ideas, then this would be a clever idea. But burying your head in the sand is never going to be a solution. If somebody feels like they are unable to do it, they shouldn't do it. But amongst the ulama, there will be ulama that their mind is able to process, understand those ideas, and also be able to produce arguments. And look at the history, it's filled with those scholars that did that. That's one thing. Then there is that hikmah which corresponds to the Sharia. For example, we talked about, for example, Philoponus. Philoponus was an early philosopher who not a Muslim, of course. This is what we're talking about. Who gave some strong arguments for creation ex nihilo, why the universe had a beginning. And so now, if I was to use his arguments to support the doctrine of the Quran, which is that the universe, Allah Ta'ala created the universe from nothing, then what's wrong with that? What's wrong with that? So that's one thing. Even Al-Hafiz Ibn Taymiyyah mentions in his Dar, Ta'arud, Al-Aql wal-Naql, that kalam can be used against the interlocutor. It can be used, even he held that position, that it can be used in order to do dafa' al-shubahat, amongst doubtful things. So, as for what corresponds to it, then this is fine. It's just another way of explaining it. It's just a tafsir. For example, the term wajib al-wujud. It's just a term that explains very well as-samad. Then you have those matters that neither oppose the Sharia, nor are they compatible with it. They have no use. So they would be considered to be folly and useless. However, even then, for example, to open up the mind of the scholar to be able to understand arguments, to understand what people are thinking, and that even there could be an argument that it's not important right now, but what if it becomes important? This is a really interesting question. Do you know why I say this? Somebody asked a question yesterday in the class of EG at Khairabādīs Institute. Asked the question about, well, if you have karamat of the awliya, what about Dajjal, right? Is he not going to perform miracles, and etc.? Now, I explained the response to that through AI, which is the idea that the difference between miracle and magic, let's say, or any other kind of trickery, is that can be learnt. Whereas the mu'jiza is something that you can't learn, right? It's something that is directly the fi'l of God, the act of God. Whereas in the time of Dajjal, you've already got AI that can mimic human behavior to such a degree that they could actually resurrect your dead relative. It could look, sound, feel like your dead relative. And I'm saying, imagining this in the future, because so much of our lives is online that for AI, through its deep learning, will be able to almost recreate even to be able to anticipate what you would have responded in that situation. So it could just be trickery. Now, if you were to say, is it important for ulama to study AI? Now you may say, well, it's neither here, neither there. It's irrelevant. But what if not today, but let's say in 20 years' time, do you need to have Muslims that are fully aware of what you are able to achieve with AI? Because what if at that time there's an issue that comes about with it? So the reason why I mention that is because you could have things that are neither here or neither there today, but that might not necessarily be the case tomorrow. So even then, when you find within the books of hikmah things that maybe the Sharia hasn't spoken about, but there's like a lot of discussion of cosmology. There are many discussions of cosmology that will exist, many discussions of physics that will exist, like discussing the anasir arba'a. Doesn't necessarily have a huge role to play.
What are the anasir arba'a?
The four elements, like wind, fire, water, and mud, right? So these, in any case.
Yeah, but just to add here that, of course, you're not going to find 3 separate books of philosophy.
Sure.
One that has matters that are haram, one that has matters that correspond to Sharia, and those that are neither correspond or are against the Sharia per se. So you're going to have you could say, a compendium of all them things. So in that compendium is philosophy itself. What you're saying here and what we're agreeing on is that philosophy as a science, as a discipline, would be wajib kifayatan, meaning it would be obligatory or necessary communally, and the reason for this would be tathhīr ad-Dīn, which is to defend the religion of Islam.
But even then, the scholars mention that the teacher who's going to be teaching that has to fulfill certain conditions.
And one of those is inhimak, which is to be diligent, attentive, cautious. He must have solid grounding on aqidah, of course. And at every juncture in the study of that science or in that discipline, he should be able to do Ithbāt al-Ḥaq, which is to establish truth, and Inqār al-Bātil, to be able to deny and to be able to respond to falsehood. So at every juncture he should be able to do that. And lastly, he must possess Zihn Salim, meaning he has to be somebody, how do you translate Zihn Salim?
Intelligent.
He must be intelligent. As
sound intellect.
Right. So that's very interesting because that allows us to understand how Muslims in the post-classical period thereafter did engage with philosophy, and how you find it in the Ottoman curriculum, why you find it in the Nizami curriculum and other parts of the world. Essentially, the idea is tathhīr ad-Dīn, which is to defend Islam from bogus ideas and positions that would have existed. The benefit, what's the benefit of studying this science?
Well, as you said, one of the first things is tathhīr ad-Dīn.
Yeah.
It's like literally, I always say it's like soldiers on the border. Secondly, it actually increases one's intelligence because they're forced to think. Thirdly, you have to understand something. It's a great source of pride for Muslims. You know, like when you had, you remember back in the day when there's like on a TV and you've got a Muslim that's going to go up and defend Islam amongst a whole bunch of non-Muslims, for example, and there's certain people that when they would walk up, you're like, because either their language is weak or their arguments are normally weak. And then you had some people that when they walked on, you're like, yeah, he's going to give them a good run for their money. Why? Because you knew that person was intelligent, well-read, their references on point. See, so there's even from that perspective, a spiritual perspective, there's a fakhr. There's a fakhr in that actually there's no leaps of faith in Islam. Your faith grows with questioning. This is not about, be filled by the Holy Ghost. This is about be filled with knowledge. Believe, wa'alamu, like know, annahu la ilaha illallah, or la ilaha illahu, right? Like you have to know it, you have to have knowledge of it. And I think from that perspective, there's a lot of fakhr and pride that can come with that.
And that's interesting as well, because you mentioned one of the byproducts of studying philosophy is that it gives the student tasheezu zihn, which is it sharpens the mind greatly, profoundly. If you look at the Farangī Maḥallī curriculum tradition, they engaged heavily with the ma'kulat. They engaged with logic, with philosophy itself. You had commentaries upon commentaries, sub-commentaries, and independent works on philosophy and falsafah that were written by the Farangī Maḥallīs and their subsequent offshoot, the Khairabādīs. Now, one could be led to think that one of the reasons for this deep study of the ma'kulat within that tradition was because of their context, that they were living in the late Mughal Empire, and because there was a need for intelligent people to go into bureaucracy and to serve in the empire. Therefore, the curriculum had a great amount of rational sciences, a great amount of logic and philosophy that existed within it. But actually, what you find is that the reason why these subjects existed within the syllabus was essentially tathhīr ad-Dīn. The reason why philosophy is studied is and why it's wajib al-ta'allum kifayatan, why it's necessary to be studied communally by people who fit a certain description, is because they are essentially defending the deen from those things that are against it, from those creedal issues that do not conform to the religion of Islam. And that was the maqsad-e-a'la, the higher objective of why so much philosophy was and so much of the study of the rational sciences existed, which was what? Which was to defend the religion of Islam. And as a byproduct, this science, the study of these sciences, gave a person profound sharpness of the mind, and who better than to employ inside the bureaucracy of your empire than people with sharp minds. And that was the Farangī Maḥallīs, and some of them did, it's true, some of them did end up serving within the empire, but that was not the entirety of them, some of them, and it was as a byproduct of their intelligence that was created from the rigorous curriculum of the Nizami way. Moving on, this is an important discussion I think we should have, which is that, there's an age-old Orientalist objection against philosophy in the Muslim world in general. I'm going to build on this and then we can discuss it very briefly and we'll move on. It's not the objective of our podcast today, but I think we should throw it in there. That the Isharat wa Tanbihat of Ibn Sīnā, and I'll open with this, is that it is known to contain a section on tasawwuf, right? Sufism. In fact, new ideas and interpretations were brought forward which within philosophy in the classical period, in this formative period, which satisfied the demands of reason, along with at times attempting to work under the framework of the Holy Quran. Now, as a disclaimer here, this is not to say that all the ideas fit on the scales of the Quran and Sunnah, but we're merely highlighting the fact that they had a sense of originality in their work, right? And philosophers in the Muslim world managed to formulate this new distinct system that was away from the Greeks as well. But again, we're not saying that they were totally away from the Greeks, but there's the argument of some originality that exists in their works. And what should we say about this, age-old Orientalist objection or point of view that philosophy in the Muslim world, particularly in this classical period, it was just a copy and paste of Hellenic philosophy? Is it true?
I think the proof is in the pudding, really. The fact that Avicenna replaces those from before him, the fact that he reworks, as I said before, the works of Aristotle, the fact that he adds to logic.
Interesting.
Some very important additions. Not the place here, but if somebody wants to, they can go look up. There's entire works written on the additions. He changes the categorization of mantiq. I mean, largely before him, it was mainly just a discussion on the kulliyat khams, on the universals at that level. But he brings in some very important additions. Also, Qutb-ud-Din al-Razi, of course, after him, is probably the two most important people in terms of logic. So, when people sort of say, well, I mean, it's not like we're defending the Ḥukamāʻ of Islam. Like, we're not sat here saying, oh, we have to defend them. But objectively looking at it, they had their own tradition. Furthermore, what people sometimes do not or include into Falsafah is Falsafah tasawwuf, right? That some of the mystics of Islam, so to speak, included much of their philosophy and their very interesting and insightful takes on very deep philosophical discussions. The likes of as-Suhrawardi, the likes of Shaykh al-Akbar, and many others, although yes, we would say, or like al-Kashani, you know, the likes of Sadruddin al-Qunavi, etc., they had some huge contributions as falsafa in and of itself. So I think that's not helpful. What we can say is that they definitely leaned on the traditions that came before them. Of course they did. But they also had originality and they also developed. And I think that for anyone that knows anything about Islamic intellectual history without bias, that they would admit that.
Yeah, I was actually reading through Dr. Sayyid Tawfiq's PhD on the philosophy, the Masha'i way. And he actually mentions this point, actually. He says that, you know, when Platonic ideas were taken by the West, it was immediately accepted by Christians as a means of legitimizing the interpretations of Christianity, basically, and scripture. So when Orientalists now look at the Muslim world, they think, it's assumed that they did the same thing happen in the Muslim world as well. That they just took it all and digested it all as it is, because it was a means for them to justify their scripture as well. And that's been hypothesized by Dr. Sayyid Tawfiq. And
I don't think that's even true there, by the way. I think to say that is to say that you haven't read Augustine, you haven't read Aquinas, you haven't read Maimonides, you haven't read from the Jewish tradition, you haven't read, although actually Maimonides is a bad example because he's considered to be
Jewish.
No, but he's considered to be within Islamic hikmah. Because remember, he's in the Iberian Peninsula, he's in Andalusia.
Arabic philosophy,
yeah, so he's considered to be within Arabic philosophy. So maybe we can leave him out. But there are some hugely important writers within the Christian tradition of philosophy that, yes, they borrowed, they benefited. Of course, they do. Every tradition does. That's, you know, there's always a continuation of sorts. But I think with the Islamic tradition, hikmah, as you pointed out earlier, had a particular objective. It wasn't objectiveless. It had an objective. It took on a certain flavor, and it brought many, many important contributions. Many important contributions.
And it's interesting because you know, if you just look at this point as well, like Kindī, for example, like irrespective of all his positions, and neither am I claiming to know all of his positions, but he does acknowledge the superiority of the Quran. Interesting, even like that point you mentioned there with Ibn Sīnā as well, like he even uses the word hikmah for philosophy, which is from the Quran, the word hikmah.
So there was a level of originality to what they were writing, and in that there is no doubt. And I think a proof of that is going to be, you know, to be honest, I would say proof of that is their focus on theology, because all of the above names that you mentioned were heavily focused on discussions of theology. So that even that in and of itself is a very specific thing to the Islamic tradition.
That's right. So even like with Ibn Sīnā, for example, you know, instead of, he'll use the word madda instead of hulula. But this is nevertheless though, Ibn Sīnā, meaning his lens is the Masha'i way, and it's a continuation of this Masha'i way. Even though even if he wrote a commentary of the Quran, even if he, you know, would have translated, you know, used his own terms as such. So just to conclude then, this Orientalist age-old objection, does it have any weight?
No, and they themselves don't agree with it anymore. Actually, if you look at what the modern writings, like they used to say that, one point to be noted is that they used to say that al-Ghazālī destroyed philosophy, and now we know that in modern philosophy that didn't really happen. However, I think what is true to say on that one, where is that the style of philosophizing of the Ḥukamāʻ, that was definitely stopped by al-Ghazālī. Philosophy was not stopped.
Yeah, and obviously we are particularly talking about this formative period anyway. But moving on to this discussion, this is a very important discussion, because this is like, we got to flesh this one out really well, inshallah, is that there is a distinction between theologians and the philosopher, right? But what we do find is that in Ash'ari Kalam, and by extension Maturidis included in this as well, they did come to incorporate major areas of Greek logic and much of the metaphysical terminologies and categories of philosophy into their Kalamic experience, you could say. How do we understand Falsafah from a traditionalist standpoint? How are we going to understand it from a traditionalist standpoint? And this is a good juncture to actually look at philosophy that existed in this post-classical period and onwards.
In terms of its distinction with theology, or how do you want to?
Yeah, in terms of with this distinction with theology itself.
Well, for example, we know that some of the great, and you mentioned this before, that sometimes even the likes of al-Ghazālī and al-Rāzi are considered to be from the Ḥukamāʻ Islamiyun, right?
Yeah.
Which is, from one perspective, true, in that they dealt with philosophy. But they were mutakallimun. And so I think here has to be a distinction made. So somebody may say, but hold on, if you read some of the major theological works, like, for example, the Matālib al-Aliyah of Rāzi, or you read the Mawaqif of E.G., right? And the commentary by Jurjani, or the Sharh al-Maqasid of Taftazani, all of these later great works of theology, they all begin with the Umur Amma, don't they?
Which is in English, how would you translate that?
Perhaps ontology, you could translate it as ontology. The study of being, right? It's looking at discussions of wahda, kathara, looking at discussion of oneness and multitude or multiplicity, looking at discussion of jawhar, arad, huge discussions, and sometimes an entire volume is set aside just to discuss the jawhar, the concept of atom.
The second volume of the Sharh Maqasid is just on the Maqasid. All these discussions are
absolutely.
found in there.
So why I mention that is because somebody may pick that up and say, well, hold on a minute, this is just all Falsafah. Yes, in that this is Falsafah, but no, in that they are trying to take you down a certain line of argumentation to get to their objective, which is establishing, let's say, the contingency of the universe.
Ithbat ad-Dīn.
Ithbat ad-Dīn, absolutely. So that entire volume or 2 volumes that you just read, all of it was to establish their sughra, their minor premise of an argument, which is that the universe is temporal.
Fantastic.
And then whatever is temporal must have a cause. The rest of it will be, so really all it was they had a particular argument, a rational argument, and now they are substantiating that argument sometimes in 9 volumes, right? That's what it is. There was a single purpose to this. Whereas as you're talking about, and I'm not talking about the Ḥukamāʻ Islamiyun per se, but even if you were to deal with them, the fact that they included in that early period discussions on politics and economics, and the mutakallimun had no need with that. That's immediately a distinction between them. Like al-Kindī, al-Fārābī, all of them have books on this. Ibn Sīnā has a book on akhlaq, on ethics. So they were writing kal-falasifa, even if they were Muslims. But they were like, how do I explain this? I mean, this is really not a good example, but perhaps it may just help. They were like academics who are Muslim.
Because I actually had a discussion with the Shaykh al-Hadith, ʻAllāmah Faẓl-i al-Qadri on this very recently as well. And what he was saying was that, Falsafah books in the post-classical period, like Hadiyya Sayyidiyya, or you have the Shams-i Bāzigha, or you have Hidāyat al-Ḥikmah, they were essentially written by what we would term as Ḥukamāʻ Islamiyun. And he counts in amongst them Imām al-Ghazālī and Imām al-Rāzi as well to be amongst these Ḥukamāʻ Islamiyun. And what Ustad said was that the intent of these books on philosophy in this later period is to learn the istilahat and the terminologies of the philosophers. As in the early time, the Mu'tazila and other sects, they used the principles of the philosophers in order to prove their kalam and their version of Islam and their ideas. So the usul and the principles were of the philosophers, and those principles were taken by the Mu'tazila, and they constructed their kalam on that, and their kalam became the kalam of their day. Then what you find is that because their kalam is based upon principles of the philosophers, the Ḥukamāʻ Islamiyun came along and they took those usul, they recognized which usul and which principles were being used, and they began to make mention of them. When they began to make mention of them, because the Ḥukamāʻ Islamiyun or the mutakallimin, they were responding to false ideologies. So because those false ideologies are based upon the principles of the philosophers, you find that whilst responding to those ideologies in their books of kalam, you find that kalam then ends up becoming mixed with philosophy. So you're going to open up Sharh al-Aqaid and you're going to be having discourses on Jawhar and Huyula, hylomorphism and the indivisible atom, and interesting discussions that exist within the books. So Ustad Sahib actually said that, he goes, what we find later on is that our refutation which happens from the science of kalam, essentially our refutation becomes mawqoof upon and becomes reliant upon understanding philosophy itself. So therefore they teach this within the curriculum in order to equip the ulama, in order to answer and rebuttal the Qadariyah, Jabariyah, Mu'tazila, and their various branches and offshoots that exist even in today's world as well. So the idea of them writing on philosophy, as you mentioned fantastically, that point was brilliant, you hit the point home there, which was like an academic exercise. And the idea of doing that was ta'yīd al-Islam, to support and defend the religion of Islam from and for refutation of these misguided sects. So they actually transmit those positions of the philosophers in these books in order to refute. And this is interesting as well, because the āllāmah al-Abharī, who we're going to talk about later on, he also brings the usul of the Masha'i way of the peripatetics in his Hidāyat al-Ḥikmah, and this was documented for refutation of philosophy. They, at the end of the day, were Muslims, and we do not expect them to have bad beliefs. Actually, majority of them were Sunnis as well.
There's a call from Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal, who said that when you're rebuttaling your opponent, don't mention their position, because if somebody was to read your work and they don't get to your answer, they've only read the interlocutor's objection. So that was his position. So some people, again, Tony is interesting. Tony Adams, for example, he mentions that al-Ghazālī, that some have said that was a mistake on his part in the Tahafut, exactly what you're saying, which is that he shouldn't have listed out their positions, because he actually, people assumed he was a philosopher. In the West they did. My response to that is, yes, perhaps when only the Maqasid came out in Latin, that they believed that in the West, right? But Muslims didn't believe that, right? In fact, the proof is that the methodology of Avicenna stopped in that way. You've got Dawani, and I'm going to get to him later.
Yeah.
You've got that type of philosophy, but that, when you're writing purely as an academic and not as a theologian, not as a Muslim scholar, etc., you're just writing for the sake of philosophy itself. But because you're a Muslim, you're happy to deal with theological issues, as opposed to I'm a theologian and I happen to deal with philosophical issues. They're two very different things, aren't they? Yeah. That methodology stopped. So nobody was unclear. It was because they saw the argument of the philosopher, and then they saw the strength of the argument of the mutakallim. That's what stopped that lineage of Ḥukamāʻ. So it's actually a response that no. So when people say, but they shouldn't be doing that in the books of philosophy. There's a wrong what Taftazani is doing, and what Giorgiani is doing, and what E.G. is doing, and what all of those people that you just mentioned is wrong what they did. No, it's not wrong what they did, and the proof for that is, where do you see in this period of domination of the Ash'ariyah, you see the domination of other groups? Once the Mu'tazila were finished, then you had the rise of the Ḥukamāʻ ideas like of Ibn Sīnā. Once that is finished by the Ash'ariyah, what do you see after that? Up until Ibn Taymiyyah, and even Ibn Taymiyyah in his time was not popular. In his time he was not popular. In fiqh, yes, a family of his grandfather, of course, the Majd. But in terms of his ideas, were they really widespread? No, they weren't widespread. So if you look at it, it's kind of, it's sort of like it's back at you. That the proof that this works is that it worked.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's interesting. So that's I'm glad we got that point out there. for people, and sometimes it upsets people as well. You know, that this is the take that we have on falsafa in general, because it's this kullu jadidin ladidun. Everything new is exciting, and people want to get people get interested in it. But there's a methodology and a manhaj that exists that our ulama and our scholars and mashayikh have given us in navigating.
Shall I tell you your problem?
Sciences.
Shall I tell you your problem? You know, if you, not everybody, of course, not everybody. There's some people, inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. It's going to happen. But you know, if you spent 10, 12, whatever years of your training, your formal training, right, with, let's say, masters of fiqh, with books of fatwa, you saw the genius of the scholars of usul al-fiqh. I'm talking about Islamic legal theory and jurisprudence. You spent time with them, you saw their inner workings, you learned, you conversed with them. Then even if in masail jadida, in new issues, in the waqi' and in the nawazil, when you got new issues, and you will, even if the fatwa is going to change from what it was before, it will always happen with adab. Because you're going to rely upon them of how they gave fatwa to give a fatwa. You'll never belittle them, even if the fatwa in your day is different to them. Yeah. You're going to say this fatwa is what they would have given if they were here. Why? Because we're using the same methodology that they used. When you spend time with the theologians, the mutakallimun, the ulama, that defended the theology of Islam, theology. There was one person, he said to me once, "Oh, forget all of this kalam stuff, yeah? There's no awliya was from them." This is someone that's a Sunni, a Sunni that said this, right? And he said, "There's no awliya from them." And I said, "What was Ghazālī?" And he went quiet. And what was Ghazālī? Wasn't he from the awliya? Like, you reckon Sayyid al-Sharif al-Jurjani was not from the awliya? So, what happens if you spend time with them, because you're a student of knowledge, when you're formally studying, you're studying all of the sciences, right? The problem that I feel and I fare with this is, because people don't have any relationship with the theologians of Islam, the ones that defended your Islam against bad creed, they're very easy to belittle them. All of this is a load of waste of time. All of this. If it was a waste of time, then they would never have engaged with it. One. Secondly, how do you know it's a waste of time when you never studied it? The problem is, you never spent time with them. Had you spent time with them, you wouldn't speak the way you're speaking. But you never spent time with them. You don't even understand what their maqasid are. If I was to ask you on a serious note, what were actually the maqasid of the mutakallimun? And this is exactly what people in the revivalist period fell into, like Ali Gar and others. In their mind, they were like, wow, look at the enlightenment, look at the scientific, technological revolution. If you want Muslims to be at the forefront, they need to be there. Tayyib. But does that mean that now they forget how to defend their aqeedah as well? Aqeedah is very easy. There's nobody asking questions. Habibi, come spend a day in my world. Step out of your bubble and step a day into my shoes and see the people in your community, just in your community, that have serious issues in the aqeedah, that with all due respect, you could have the greatest scientists that are Muslim and the greatest technological sort of advanced scientists and the guys that are making AI and doing all of that sort of that are Muslim, that's not going to solve the problem of a 17-year-old that has doubts in his aqeedah. With respect. So you can have all the technological advancements that you want. It may give you leverage in terms of political leverage, economic leverage. All of that's good. Not like anyone's saying go against it. No one's saying that. لِكُلِّ فَنٍ رِجَالٍ. Those rijal that are for this fun, leave them alone. Because they're needed. And so I think that is, forgive me for my tangent, I don't know why I went onto that, but it's because of what you said, which is the point that you made, which is true, which is people are like, well, why is it important? Habibi, it's important. You may not be able to see that. That's no problem. Don't engage with it. You relax, you do something else. But it's important, hence why these subjects, kalam in particular, all of them, they were wujub kifayatan for a reason. Somebody's got to do it.
Okay, so that's interesting, this last discussion, because born out of that discussion is this one now that we're going to have, and which is very important as well. That in the intellectuals in the post-classical tradition and the post-classical period, like Imam at-Taftazani, Mir Sayyid Jurjani, even their teacher Imam ad-Dīn al-Ījī, they are known as Sunni theologians who produced comprehensive summaries of philosophically tinged kalam, right? And we've established that from this previous discussion, right? The Mu'tazilites and them taking the principles of the philosophers, and then subsequently the mutakallimin responding to that in the books of kalam. Now, by the beginning of the 16th century, the chaos of the Mongols was becoming a distant memory, and you have new political realities that are settling in. The earliest rise to power are the Ottomans, the House of Uthman, and later you have the Mughal dynasty, a little bit later on. Now, from the domains of these two powers, you have great schools that emerge. You have the Madrasa Uthmaniyya, and you have the Madrasa of the Farangī Maḥall, the Dars-e-Nizami curriculum, syllabus, methodology study, right? Now, from these madaris, the Farangī Maḥallīs emerge, the Khairabādī tradition emerges, and they did great work in the field of the ma'kulat and the rational sciences. Let's have a breakdown of philosophy in the post-classical era, and just slightly before it as well, with the likes of Imam al-Ghazālī. So let's start with Imam al-Ghazālī and work through this post-classical era until we get to the Khairabādīs themselves, and see, now that we've understood their methodology in approaching the science, what are the important periods that exist here, and who are the key players in this time?
Well, I think al-Ghazālī we've done a lot, and we did it in the previous podcast as well. So I won't go down that route of Imam al-Haramain, al-Ghazālī, how that impacts the Razi.
That's right.
I mean, we've had these discussions quite a few times. So let's take it slightly different. Let's look at just a little bit after them.
Can I just intervene there? One discussion that we didn't have last time, which we could have now, is the debate between Ibn Sīnā and Imam Ghazālī revisited.
Yes, this is exactly, I was going to talk about this, which is the idea that just after that period, it wasn't like it's done, it's over. No, they continued it, but it continued differently in different places. So for example, in Iberia, let's say in Muslim Spain, you had the likes of Ibn Rushd. He had his own way of doing it that wasn't very successful, right? Meaning it just wasn't accepted generally by the Muslims. And I mentioned before that his way of treating Imam al-Ghazālī's response to Ibn Sīnā was not by saying to Ghazālī that you're wrong, but by saying that you're right to criticize Ibn Sīnā, but wrong for that criticism to apply to Aristotle, because Ibn Sīnā didn't quite understand or explain correctly Aristotle. That's a huge claim. So he was saying, had you truly understood what the quote-unquote position is of the Mashā'iyyah, then you would not have criticized him in this way. So that was one style of dealing with it. The other, like an example of Khajazada within the Ottoman Empire, who writes, debates. In fact, Fatih Sultan Mehmed had this debate before him, which is who was right. I mean, even if you look at the way that they did that, it wasn't like it's set in stone. It was who was right. I want to hear about it. I mean, it also shows the level of learning of Fatih Sultan Mehmed, and you could talk for days perhaps about these examples of the level of learning of these Salatin. But Khajazada's response to al-Ghazālī is not like Ibn Rushd. He's not saying to al-Ghazālī, you were right, but only because Ibn Sīnā got it wrong. He was saying, you misunderstood what Ibn Sīnā was saying. And so, although they all prefer Ghazālī and say that he's correct, where they differed, some of them, is that where takfir is made, perhaps is not takfir. Where takfir is made. So it's not to say that we agree with everything Ibn Sīnā said, but some of them, not all of them, they were saying, you're right, but maybe it doesn't, there's a way of looking at it that it's not takfir. So there was a way where they had some samaha, it seems, towards Avicenna.
And just off the back of that, this argument that Imam Ghazālī destroyed philosophy,
As I mentioned earlier, if what you mean by that, the school of the Ḥukamāʻ, where they are philosophers dealing with theology as opposed to theologians dealing with philosophy, then yes, he did. Because where are they? Like Dawani is a theologian who's heavily immersed in philosophy, who does deal with philosophy, and I'll get to him in a minute, where he deals with philosophy independently, he does, but he's still primarily a theologian.
Their grounding is footed
They begin as theologians.
within Kalam.
Yeah, they begin as theologians. So Al-Ghazālī was very important.
Yeah, because it could be argued that he only attacks certain metaphysical explanations of the
course.
philosophers in his tahafut. But actually, he,
You know what
in
I
other
believe
places,
he
he
did?
promotes logic.
But you know what I believe? And this is just my opinion. So, I believe that Al-Ghazālī, you know what I talked about earlier about one of the benefits that people overlook is that it gives you fakhr, yeah, a pride, right? I believe that Al-Ghazālī did such an important job in his philosophical writings to defend the orthodoxy of Sunni Islam, both against the Batiniyya, for whom he was taken out of Khalwa, by the way, by Nizam al-Mulk to respond to the Batiniyya. And also the Ḥukamāʻ, is that it gave fakhr to the theologians. Isn't like, why would I want to be from the Ḥukamāʻ when I can be a mutakallim? Like that's where the real activity is, right?
Nice.
You see, so that's what I think it's like it's, I think it's a little bit like if you were living in an area where the dominant thing to study is fiqh, for example, then you want to be amongst the dominant culture. So with Al-Ghazālī, he dominated philosophy as a mutakallim, and so kalam became the dominant culture. Hence why we have the greatest mutakallimin coming about. Some of the greatest mutakallimin come after him. Not saying that the early ones were not great, they were great. Probably in sharaf they were greater in many ways. But in terms of the length and breadth of the tradition, how it was developed after Al-Ghazālī is unbelievable.
Interesting.
Yeah. So I think it gave a lot of fakhr to that. So I think that's one thing to look at. But if I could just mention a couple of other, I talked earlier about the Matālib al-Aliyah, for example, this absolutely amazing seminal work where Al-Razi, although he is commenting on theology, actually his style of writing is purely philosophical. Yeah. In fact, you don't quote Matālib al-Aliyah to get Razi's position, because he just outlines the positions of the Ḥukamāʻ. So that has a very particular purpose on it. Also, thereafter you have the likes of the students of al-Ijī, as you mentioned. Of course you got Ijī, but we dedicated a section to him in a previous podcast.
Yeah.
But the likes of Taftazani, these are now what we call muḥaqqīqūn.
This is during the period of the royal court of Samarkand, right? This is Timur.
Timur. And he's again orchestrating debates and stuff. Now I remember when we did the podcast with Shaykh al-Hadīth, Hafidhullah Ta'ala, we asked him that when you say muḥaqqīqūn, like when the book say muḥaqqīqūn, like who does that include? And he said that includes Sunnis and non-Sunnis too, sometimes. What does that mean then? It means tahqiq is the essence of falsafah. So now you got Taftazani, Jurjani, who are mutakallimun, but they are also muḥaqqīqūn, which means what? That they will do tahqiq of the mas'ala in light of all of the sciences. That's really unique. I think people should pause upon what I just said there for a moment. That they are mutakallimun, but when they approach a mas'ala, they do it with tahqiq. Tahqiq. It's not just blind imitation or regurgitation, but it is actually focused, verified, authenticated research and study.
And this is the point as well I mentioned earlier, that these theologians are producing comprehensive summaries on philosophically tinged kalam, basically.
And if I could just mention something about Dawani before we move on, which is, do you know the first work of a Dawani that was circulating in the Western Academy and that was translated into, I believe, Latin first? What do you think? Do you think of a Dawani was his theological work? It was his work on Tahdhīb al-Akhlaq?
Interesting.
Yeah, it's called Akhlaq Dawaniya. So it was his work on ethics. So hold on, but we don't write like that as mutakallimun, right? But why was Dawani writing on it? But he was. So just like al-Kindī wrote a book on Madaniya, on siyasa,
Madani, politics.
yeah, politics, Dawani is writing a book in ethics. Yeah. So you can see now how Dawani is a theologian, you know, but he's also involved heavily in philosophy. Like he's writing independent works, but when he's writing a book on akhlaq, he'll be writing it with the Islamic tradition in mind.
Yeah, of course, because this is the reason why hikmat amaliya, which was practical philosophy, was removed from the discussion altogether, because we have the Quran and Sunnah for that, right? So we got Lama Dawani, you know, in that period you have the Dashtakis as well. And then this is obviously...
And the Shirazis.
The Shirazis. So Allāmah Fatḥullāh Shirazi is very important. We start with Mir Sayyid, Jurjani, Allāmah Taftazani, we come down to the period of Allāmah Dawani. This is in the Persian Empire, just before the rise of the Safavids. We've talked about Allāmah Dawani, and then moving on from there, you find Allāmah Fatḥullāh Shirazi. Now, the books from the Shirazi tradition, they enter the Islamic studies of the subcontinent, the Indian subcontinent, and Allāmah Fatḥullāh Shirazi is basically that. Is basically the link between the Persian world and the world of the late Mughal
the
Empire,
subcontinent,
basically, and that's via one of his students who was from the subcontinent. Now, Allāmah Fatḥullāh Shirazi is obviously is a teacher of someone known as Abdus Salam Lahori. He's the teacher of Allāmah Abdus Salam ad-Dīwi, and he's the teacher of Maulana Danyal, who's the teacher of Mullah Qutbuddin al-Shahid, who's the teacher of Mullah Nizamuddin al-Sihalbi, the namesake of the Dars Nizami curriculum. And interestingly, I have wrote an article on this. It's called Shiraz to the Farangī Maḥall, a link forging 300 years of advanced intellectual discourse. You can find that on Khairabādīinstitute.com, and you can have a look at that. But what's interesting is that you find that Fatḥullāh Shirazi is this intellectual from the Persian world who essentially brings the ma'qulat tradition and this intellectual discourse of the rational sciences into what we know as the Indian subcontinent, and then from there streams the Farangī Maḥallī tradition and the Khairabādīs as well. So what's interesting about the Farangī Maḥallīs is that this Shirazi tradition of the rational sciences, they comment on that and they teach it inside their madrasa, which is now formally known as the Dars Nizami.
Books like Nabzi,
the Mebudi and Mullah Sadr and others. So these books are being commented on. But one thing to note as well is they became known for the rational sciences. One thing, just as a disclaimer, I want to make mention of here as well is that although the Farangī Maḥallīs were known for the ma'qulat and they were known for the rational sciences, that's not to say at all that they were simultaneously not known for the manqulat as well. Sometimes when Orientalists look into the Muslim world, they make very oversimplified distinctions in order to make sense of the reality on the ground. And that's because they don't understand the culture and that world, that part of the world. So when they would have looked at the late Mughal period of the subcontinent, they will look at two major madrasas, which are the Madrasa Rahimiyya and the Madrasa of the Farangī Maḥall in Lucknow, and one obviously in Delhi. And the oversimplified distinction would be is that they were the scholars of the transmitted sciences, the Madrasa Rahimiyya, and the ulama of the Farangī Maḥall were the scholars of the rational sciences. And this is a very oversimplified distinction that's made. Actually, it wasn't the case. The rational sciences were broadly accepted in both of those madrasas and the rest of India as well. Because one primary example of that is Allāmah Faẓl-i Ḥaq Khairabādī, rahimahullah, his line is a continuation of the Farangī Maḥall school, but he's also a recipient of the education of Madrasa Rahimiyya and the ulama of Delhi, because he's a direct student of Shah Abdul Aziz Muhaddis Dehlawi. So
also, if people just read Shah Waliullah,
Shah Waliullah as well.
Shah Waliullah has in fact, Shah Waliullah has a book on politics.
Fantastic. And one other point to add to that as well is that in the similarly, the scholars of the Farangī Maḥall, although they are involved in the rational sciences, well, the Madrasa Rahimiyya is also known for the rational sciences. Shah Abdul Aziz Muhaddis Dehlawi is a great Ma'quli scholar. But at the same time, the Farangī Maḥallīs are also known for the transmitted sciences. Some of the greatest tafasir, they are muhaddiseen. You know, some of the greatest commentaries of the Quran are found with the Farangī Maḥallīs.
They are known by academics even to be very strong in fiqh.
Exactly, that's right. And you know, Mullah Waliullah has a very important commentary of the Quran. They're known for hadith. They are muhaddisun.
Abdul Hayy al-Laknawi.
Yes.
Is Abdul Hayy al-Laknawi. Like remember, he's a descendant of Mullah Nizamuddin.
Yes, that's
right. It's not like he's just. So Abdul Hayy al-Laknawi has one of the greatest commentaries on the Hidāyat. Abdul Hayy al-Laknawi has some of the greatest works in hadith that have been written, period. In fact, when Shaykh Abdul Fattah Abu Ghudda came from Syria to India, he was astonished. Remember, he's primarily a muhaddith, Shaykh Abdul Fattah Abu Ghudda. When he came, he couldn't believe what he saw. And so he took what's called Silsilat al-Laknawiyat, right? So he just took Allāmah al-Laknawi's books back and started to work on them, edit them, and publish them. So this idea, Abdul Hayy al-Laknawi simultaneously has Hawashi on the Sharh al-Aqaid, upon the Sulam al-Ulum, and upon all of the books of the Ma'qulat, but also has commentaries on hadith.
That's right.
Commentaries on fiqh. You know, so it's like this. I get what you're trying to say. I think with the Orientalists, I'll tell you what you do. You know, when you have when you don't have a broad understanding of a tradition, it's easier to categorize it in this way.
Right, yeah.
Whereas when you are swimming in a tradition and you're trying to really dig deep, you realize there's much more nuance than that.
Yeah, and so, and also, you know, even if you go to the Arab world, in Jami'at al-Azhar, Al-Azhar University, up until the 20th century, you had the works like Risala Shamsiyya still being taught.
Which they're reviving now, can you believe it?
Now, yes.
So they realized, and I've had conversation with many Azharites, that it's very difficult to become a scholar without studying in the masjid of Al-Azhar. Because now because they're reviving all of the classical books, because they realized that it's difficult to give like tamliq, like to really give malaka and the ability to pierce through the tradition, except through very difficult texts.
Yeah.
And so they're reviving a lot of those works, which is really interesting.
That's what's incredible about the Farangī Maḥall tradition, that these works did exist in them, and many parts of the world still incorporate those works within the tradition, especially when it comes to philosophy. So traditionally they would have taught al-Maybudi's commentary on the Hidāyat al-Ḥikmah of āllāmah al-Abharī, and then they would have taught Mullah Sadra's commentary on the Hidāyat al-Ḥikmah of al-Abharī, and particularly the Ilahiyat section for that, and the Tab'iyat section from Maybudi. And then they would finish with the Mullah Mahmud Jaunpuri's Shamsi Bazigha. So they had an entire tradition.
أكثر من ذلك, look, you know, if you look at these traditions, that's what they would do, and then they would say, oh, okay, so now we finished that, it's not like we're done now. So imagine, we've studied the books of Kalam, we've studied Umur Amma, we've studied the books of Hikmah, we've studied the books of Mantiq. Are they going to stop in their philosophical activities? No. Now let's open up Futuhat Makkiyah. I think, like now, they've been studying the Masnawi of Rumi, which is filled with mystical philosophy. They all read the Shaykh al-Akbar. Not just the Futuhat. Whatever Shaykh al-Akbar had written, the Fusus, you know how many commentaries we have? If we're just going to focus in for the purposes of our main interest area, then we're going to focus in on the Farangī Maḥall, for example. Not just the Farangī Maḥall, let's just look at the subcontinental tradition. Because before the Farangī Maḥall is an 18th century phenomena, right? If we were to look at Mullah Jami, for example, who's, okay, Afghanistan, but let's say in that broad tradition, right? Of whose books are circulated in the subcontinent at the very least. And many others, I've got a list actually at home of scholars who in that period commented on the Fusus in India. How many commentaries you have in that part of the world. You know, notwithstanding Iraq and the Arab world, etc., just in this part of the world. So what were they doing? So philosophical tasawwuf was part of that study of hikmah. But if you want to compartmentalize all of this, you can say this is tasawwuf, this is hikmah, this is kalam, this is mantiq. Yeah. But all of those are ma'qulat. All of those are achieving the same objective in some shape or form. So this idea that, and Shah Waliullah wasn't Akbarian, I can prove to you he was Akbarian.
That's right.
Heavily influenced by Shaykh al-Akbar. You know, so just because Shah Waliullah al-Muhaddith al-Dehlwi introduces the sitta, you know, the 6 hadith books, that does not mean that they didn't have a focused study of hadith before. They did.
And vice versa for the Farangī Maḥallīs as well.
Of course. No, but they're all together in this. I'm talking about the subcontinent. They had hadith, they knew hadith. At the very least, they had Mishkat and other books. They had it, they studied ulum al-hadith. It's chapter 3 of any usul al-fiqh work in the Hanafi school, right? They had it. You can say with Shah Waliullah, he made it a bit of a takhassus, personal takhassus of his. But if you read Shah Waliullah's works, most of his works are philosophical in nature. Most of them. So
it's just this Orientalist approach that, you know, they oversimplify this idea that, oh, the Madrasa Rahimiyya and Shah Waliullah and that camp, they became these literalists, puritanical kind of scholars.
Salafis.
And the Farangī Maḥallī world were like these rationalists. They, you know, they were like a type of neo-Mu'tazilites.
Like it's Republican versus Democrat.
That's right,
right wing versus left wing.
Yeah, that's right. So moving on from the Farangī Maḥallīs, you have this great tradition of the Khairabādīs, and from the Khairabādīs you have, you know, huge Ḥukamāʻ Islamiyun. And when we mean Ḥukamāʻ Islamiyun here, we mean
like, you know, Ghazālī type of Ḥukamāʻ, not Ibn Sīnā type of Ḥukamāʻ.
That's right. And so, you know, they have extensive works on hikmah and philosophy, and we're going to read through some of them. For the viewers, they may have never heard these things before, but just to show you the plethora of works and the bonfires that exist, you know, in that part of the world tradition. And we're just as far as not even 1857. You know, this is even post the War of Independence. This is like, you know, into the 1900s even. And even after that, these works are being published, you know, in parts of India as well. So we have, first of all, ʻAllāmah Faẓl-i Imām Khairabādī, who is the author of Mirqāt. Mirqāt was recently published in Istanbul with a commentary of his grandson, ʻAllāmah Abdul Haq Khairabādī, with a fantastic work in logic. He has a talkhis of a shifa, an abridgment of the shifa of Ibn Sīnā. He has a book called Tashheezul Azhān fi Sharhi Badī' al-Mīzān, which is a work on mantiq, logic. He has a Hashiyah al-Ufuq al-Mubīn, a super commentary on Ufuq al-Mubīn by Mullah Baqir Damad. He has a Hashiyah, a super commentary on the Hashiyah Zahidiyya Qutbiyya. And although this is again like logic as a subject, but you know, at this point you just mentioned earlier fantastically that philosophy, kalam, logic, and the rational sciences in general, it turns up now not just in logic books or books of usul, but like everywhere at a certain period, at a certain point. Like even as far as in rhetoric and balagha, like ʻAllāmah Taftazani's Mukhtasar al-Ma'ani, he writes a super commentary on Qadi Mubarak's commentary of Sulam al-Ulum of Mullah Bihari, and he actually considered this one of his 2, you know, in Urdu we say yadgars, those things to be remembered with, and he actually writes this, and it was printed again in 1899, and it was printed thereafter again in 1975 by Siyal Sharif. Khwaja Qamaruddin al-Siyalwi, who's a great Akbarian Khairabādī scholar of the Chishti way, he was somebody who was huge on reviving the ma'qulat tradition of the Khairabādīs. His teachers, one of his teachers was actually Allāmah Mu'inuddin Ajmeri, who was a grand student of Allāmah Abdul Haq Khairabādī. Like that's his tradition, and he wants to revive that tradition when? As far as Zia al-Haq's period, which was just, you know, our parents, you know, parents' heydays. That would have been our parents' heydays when they were quite young still. You know, so it's not far away. He clearly seen an objective behind reviving that tradition. He has the Hadiyya Sa'idiyya, which is a work in philosophy. It was added into the Dars Nizami. It was also interestingly taught in Al-Azhar University, the Hadiyya Sa'idiyya. And his son wrote a takmila on the work. And Maulana Abdullah Bilgrami, he also wrote a super commentary called Tuhfa Ilmiya on this work as well. We have the Hashia al-Ufuq al-Mubin. He writes a super commentary on al-Ufuq al-Mubin, which is independent of his father's. And there's 2 copies of this available actually. One of them is in Aligarh University, interestingly, and the other one is in the private library of al-Allāmah Maulana Mu'inuddin Ajmeri, rahimahullah. He writes a Hashia on the Talkhis al-Miftah, so his father's Talkhis Shifa, sorry. He writes a super commentary on that. He has a work called Al-Jinsul Ghali fi Sharh al-Jawahir al-Ali. He has a Risala in Risala Tashkīk al-Mahiyat. He has a Risala fi Tahqiq al-Kulli al-Tabi'i. He has a Risala fi Tahqiq al-Ilm wal-Ma'lum. Recently this was printed by Maulana Ghulam Haidar Khairabādī. He has a Risala Categorias in logic. He has a Risala fi Tahqiq Haqiqat al-Ajsam. He has a Risala fi Raddi al-Qa'ilina bi Harakat al-Ard. And then his son, Allāmah Abdul Haq Khairabādī, has a plethora of works that he writes in the Ma'kulat tradition. We don't have time to go through all of them, but I'll give you 2 or 3. His famous one is the commentary on Hidāyat al-Ḥikmah. He has a commentary on Hidāyat al-Ḥikmah, which is around 238 pages. And it was edited by his father's student, Allāmah Abdullah Bilgrami. He has a fantastic work on philosophy. Actually, very short work in philosophy. It's only 65 pages. And it's called the Zubdatul Hikmah. It's actually in the Urdu language. And his son, Asadul Haq, wrote a 19-page appendix at the end of the book. And finally, he has a Hashia Jadida on Sharh al-Tajreed of At-Tusi, which you recently gifted to our Ustad, Allāmah Faẓl-i Subhan Qadri. So that for you guys is a demonstration of, you know, the kind of intellectual heights that the ulama, as far as, you know, a couple of decades ago almost, had reached in terms of the Ma'kulat tradition and in philosophy, particularly over here. So moving on, one last discussion that we want to have here before we get into the Hidāyat al-Ḥikmah of Allāmah al-Abharī is a very important discussion as well. This discussion needs to be had, and we want to contextualize this a little bit. That does medieval philosophy hold significant relevance in today's educational curriculums, particularly those people who are emphasizing tradition? Is there a place for it or not?
Absolutely. I mean, we talked a little bit earlier that you can't have progress without depending, at the very least, on the past. Their terms, their style, their methodology, etc. So all of that is very important. Secondly, there is a somewhat revival even in the West of philosophy. People like Plantinga and others are quite celebrated philosophers and theologians today. Where are the Muslim equivalents? Where are they? So I think for that reason, I mean, of course we have, mashallah, some very strong Ma'quli scholars alive. But my point is, and what we need is for our brilliant, genius Kalam scholars to be on the same stage as people like that.
Interesting.
And the reason why people won't go onto that stage, aside from the fact that maybe they haven't studied it, etc., is because there's an inferiority complex. And that inferiority complex comes from the fact that we're still, in many ways, coming out of colonization. So we have to understand historically what happened to these madaris, what happened to their intellectual endeavors, why we're in the situation. So it's not about, well, we got colonized, they're materialists, so let's just do what they're doing. No, there's no point. Why would you ruin your own tradition and throw away your own classics?
And this is what I say, that we should build on the tradition. So prior to colonialism, we had our own teaching. We had scholars, we had books, we had an entire tradition. There was research, there was tahqiq, there was advancement of the arguments in refutation against ideologies which were against Islam. And then came along colonialism for 200 years. When we came out of colonialism, there was certain elements of our community that, everybody called towards reviving the tradition, but there were certain elements of that community that were heavily influenced by colonialism and modernity. And when they're calling back to traditionalism, actually they're using the vehicle of modernity in trying to quote unquote revive that tradition. And the most extreme elements of that are like the Aligarh itself, university, founded in India, near to the end of the colonial period. And the idea is, the point that I'm trying to make here is that we're not necessarily against there being a modern physics section in a book of philosophy inside your curriculum. We're not necessarily against that, so long as it's obviously conforms to Islam.
We'd actually be pro it.
But it must be built off our tradition. It must be built off the tradition that we have, because the tradition has a context. And the very reason for your physics existing, your new physics existing in that syllabus, will be based on the context of why it existed in the first place in the syllabus. So the idea of why physics was in the syllabus was to get to your section of ilahiyat, of the sections of theology, and there was a whole purpose why that was there, and the idea was to rebuttal philosophers and their ideas. So therefore, if we were to have a modern physics in our syllabus, and we were to have modern sciences inside our syllabus, there's not necessarily something that we're against, but there has to be built on our tradition and the maqasid and the objectives of why that was added into the tradition in the first place. And we must build on that and continue that trajectory. We're not against there being a new Sharh al-Aqaid al-Nasafiyya in the curriculum with advanced arguments, or arguments continuing on from where Taftazani left off for modern philosophies that exist, but it must be built off from that tradition. How are you supposed to continue from a tradition when you have no access or knowledge to that tradition in the first place?
It's like Shaykh al-Islam Mustafa Sabri Effendi, in Mawqif al-Aql, he's dealing solely with modern philosophers. All of them, whoever they are, Kant, Hegel. But he's doing so, again, rooted in his own tradition. He didn't come out of a vacuum.
That's right.
Yeah, he didn't go over and study philosophy in Cambridge and Oxford and then come back and start writing. He was actually arguing, like he was shooting from the hip. Like he was arguing from his own tradition.
That's right.
Right? And so even like last time I gave you the example of Al-Malullah Hamdi Yazir Effendi, the first translator and commentator of the Quran in the Turkish language, who translated, the Matalib, which is a work in French on philosophy, translated into Turkish, and has extensive footnotes in which, like, there's parts where he'd be like, oh, you know what he just said here, this is what we call a qadiyya shartiyya. This is what we call a qadiyya lafziyya. And he refutes Kant in a couple of places in the text. But again, he's drawing up a tradition. He knows modern philosophy, he studied it. But you have to have a level of aql, understand the whole history. That's why even today in universities, what do they study? Intellectual history.
That's right.
They're literally studying the history of these traditions and their main ideas, because it will help you in what you're trying to do now. So the only contention I have with revivalism is not that you want to increase science and study of science and technology, and it's wonderful, it's all good, we love it. It's not the fact that you want to update, increase, grow, in your knowledge of different aspects. Wonderful, we love it. The only contention is the deep desire and in some ways obsession of wanting to completely throw everything away as if it was useless, as if what they did was somehow not important. It's extreme su'u dhan, having an evil opinion of the scholars of the past. It is trampling and stamping upon their noble names and endeavors. And the barakah is in the sanad, always. The blessings are in the sanad. Now, somebody could say, the sanad is in the mafhum. You're trying to keep the sanad of the loves. Meaning, you're trying to keep the form, the surah of the sanad, whereas we are trying to keep the mafhum of the sanad. Meaning that Yani ilm al-kalam al-jadid, what Shibli Nu'mani is saying, what Ismail Haqqi Izmirli is saying, what Rashid Rida is saying, what all of these people are saying,
Sir Sayyid Ahmed
Khan, what they are all saying is that we are keeping the madda, the spirit, so to speak. I know madda and spirit don't mean the same thing, but we're keeping the essence of the sanad, and you're just keeping the form. Now, if that's true, that somebody is only trying to uphold the form, then yeah, that would be a problem. But we're saying the isnad, the chain, is the madda and the surah, to borrow the terms from holomorphism. It's the soul and the body, both of them. Yeah, It's the outward and the inward, both of them. So that means that you keep the system, the sanad, some of the major texts, you build upon them, as the Farangī Maḥallīs did with their commentaries, their glosses. You write independent works. Wallahi, I would love to see independent works written in kalam, in modern theology, dealing with secularism. I'll give you one last example, sorry. Look at Sayyid Naqib al-Attas. Sayyid Naqib al-Attas, did he throw the baby out with the bathwater? Sayyid Naqib al-Attas wrote specifically in the context of secularism. He specifically has written, let's say, books to deal with the secularization of the world and the absence of adab and hierarchy and deeper meaning and reason, right? But he has drawn upon his tradition to write the work that he did. He did not do that outside of an Islamic.
He would not be able to do that outside of the Islamic context of the.
And you know those that did try to do it?
Tradition.
The revivalists, many of them, what did they end up falling into? Denying miracles, didn't they? They denied miracles, denying huge important parts of metaphysics. They fell into so many traps, God forbid, and protect your aqaid Islamiyah. This is not like a matter of Shafi'i said, Abu Hanifa said.
I think a great service would be is that we cut out that 200 years of colonialism and say, let's go back to where they left off with their advancement and let's build upon that. And we could see in this next generation some great service towards the intellectual tradition that we have. Abdul Ghani Nablusi, he passed away in 1731, Christian era. He was already arguing for a revival among Muslim scholarship to challenge European ideas. Much later on, you see the likes of Shaykh al-Islam Mustafa Sabri Effendi, who directly goes head to head with modern philosophers in his Mawqif al-Aql. And I think off the back of that, I would ask this question and have this discussion: that how have Muslims engaged with philosophy in the recent past?
Well, exactly, it's a good point. I mean, as I mentioned a little bit earlier about Shaykh al-Islam Sabri Effendi, that he writes a book dedicated to that. You have Sayyid Nursi, again, another Turkish Ottoman scholar. In fact, I think actually he's a Kurd. But in any case, an Ottoman scholar who engages directly with secularism and with modern philosophy, calling it out and arguing from, drawing upon Islamic kalam. By the way, that's a wonderful example of how to do it, by the way. Because if somebody was to say, no, do away with it, read Sayyid Nursi, Badi al-Zaman. Why? Because he intertwines traditional kalam, tasawwuf, mantiq all together and gives some of the most important responses to modernity, such that, what's the proof? Has the largest followers of readers in terms of texts in Turkey are his followers.
That's right.
And we witnessed that. You can go to the halaqat. He preserved the Islamic identity, philosophically speaking, of the Muslims in Turkey just through his writings. He's translated to Arabic. He's extremely popular even around the world. Sayyid Nursi is a wonderful example. I gave the example earlier of Al-Malala Hamdi Yazar Effendi as well, with his translation of the Matalib, his commentary on the Quran. I can give you countless examples. Even in the subcontinent, you have people like Mullah Ahmad Rida Khan, has an independent work written in philosophy. He dies very late, don't forget. You have the likes of Pir Mehli Shah Al-Gohrawi, rahimahullah ta'ala, who writes extensively in philosophical, particularly philosophical tasawwuf. Yeah, he writes in philosophical Sufism extensively. You have the likes even of Shaykh Muhammad Karim Shah al-Azhari, right? Who in his biography of the Prophet ﷺ is directly engaging with Hume and the concept of miracles, because Hume was an empiricist, and he's having a conversation in the section of the Mi'raj. Like, these were scholars. Why were they able to do that?
And he's using rational arguments
Yes,
against
and he's quoting the Musāyarah, by the way.
You know, when you read
You know, by the way, with Aziz al-Ummat, the majority of when he generally quotes aqaid, you will see that he heavily enjoys. You know how, like in the tafsir, he relies quite heavily on al-'Allamah al-Alusi. He likes Alusi a lot. There's a number of tafsir that he really likes, you could tell. With Aqidah, mostly he's quoting the Musāyarah.
It's a fantastic work. It's like considered the alphabet of Ilm al-Kalam in the Maturidi school. Fantastic. So, just moving on now to wrapping up this podcast, inshallah, to one last objective, which is Allāmah al-Din al-Abharī and his work in philosophy known as Hidāyat al-Ḥikmah. Before we get to his work, let's just have a look and contextualize who Allāmah Abharī is. Allāmah Abharī as-Samarqandi, much less known, I'd say, than Ibn Sīnā or Fārābī or Ibn Rushd. Imām al-Ghazālī, Ibn Tusi, much less known. Let's briefly look at his life and his works. Who is he? And some contextualization to this man.
Well, he's 7th century in terms of the Hijri, and 13th century in terms of the Gregorian calendar. One of the reasons why he's less known is because he's less impactful than all of the above named. Although he's brilliant and great, I mean, he's a student of al-Imam al-Razi, so he's trained in all of the ma'qulat.
I mean, they considered him a logician, philosopher, astronomer, and mathematician.
Absolutely.
To such an extent that some scholars actually say that he's a mujtahid in the sciences. He's considered as a mujtahid scholar.
In fact, I have a quote actually. مجتهد في العلوم كما قيل عنه وعلامة عصره, and he was a hugely learned scholar of his period. لإجتهاداته. Look what they respected about him, is that he had his own ijtihad, even in mantiq, right? في باب العقوس in عكس في عكس السالبة الجزئية التي يتفق المنطقيون على أنه لا عكس لها. So everybody else on one side and he was on another side. So he was very important. He didn't mind giving his own position. But anyway, he's born in Abhar, in the province of Zarjan, in northern Iran. And Abhar was an old Persian city between Qazwin and Zanjan. He received his primary education in Abhar, as would be understood, then in Khurasan, and finally in Baghdad. It's said that he originally was born in Mosul, in Iraq, but that his family were originally from Samarkand. Yani, he's in that part of the world, and his education is generally in that part of the world. Some people have said Abhar is a tribe, and he's known as Abhari for that reason. But one of the most important things about him, as I mentioned, is that he is a student of Imam al-Razi.
Interesting.
That's huge.
And this is why some scholars actually say about him that he's not a hakim, a philosopher, but he's a mutakallim.
Yeah, of course. And I think you mentioned this once off air, which is that when we talked about this earlier as well, that when people sometimes read Hidāyat al-Ḥikmah, they're like, well, he's a philosopher.
That's right.
No, he is as much a philosopher as Ghazālī is for writing the Maqāsid.
That's right, 100%.
He was just listing out their positions.
Thank you.
It's not necessarily what he believed.
He's also, one of his teachers is also Kamāl-ud-Dīn al-Musili. And Ibn Khaliqan mentions that he'd sit before Kamāl-ud-Dīn and he'd read to him. And on the same day, he'd be teaching his own books to students as well. So, profound scholar. Interestingly, at the time of his birth, this is the time when Bukhara and Samarkand, these two regions of cities in the Muslim world, are some of the richest cities in the world. And they were on the caravan route from China to the west as well. Genghis Khan obviously launched an attack on these two cities by about 1220. So this is, they say it's possible. This is why Allāmah Abharī's family actually flees towards Khurasan.
And it's also said that he went to Anatolia, by the way, into the lands of the Turks. And maybe that's why Hidāyat al-Ḥikmah was studied in the Madrasa Uthmaniyya. Interestingly,
he was also later called by Nasiruddin al-Tusi to the observatory in Maragha, which was commissioned by Hulagu Khan from the Mongols. And you know about the observatory of Maragha, it left a huge impact in history. And the observatory had its instruments, and he had its library, and many scholars.
The Sahib al-Risala Shamsiyya.
Yeah, the author of Risala Shamsiyya would have been around as one of the quote-unquote professors with the Abharī and Nasiruddin Tusi in that time around that observatory. So he's a very interesting scholar, and you did mention about him moving to Anatolia at one point, and this is possibly why his Hidāyat al-Ḥikmah is taught in the Ottoman
was
tradition.
taught, definitely, yeah.
Definitely. One of the other things we can talk about is Allāmah Abharī. He's famously known for his Isagogy or Isagog in logic, and he's known for his Hidāyat al-Ḥikmah in philosophy. Both of them are taught today in the traditional curriculums around the world, and the Hidāyat al-Ḥikmah particularly discusses the problem of the classical Masha'i philosophy, the classical peripatetic philosophy. And Inshallah, for you viewers, if you've got to this point of the podcast, we've got some good news that we will be teaching it, inshallah azza wa jal, the entirety of the book at Khairabādī Institute, inshallah azza wa jal, in the very near future. We will be offering that, inshallah, to students, where we will go through the sections on physics and metaphysics within that book. So let's try to contextualize the book itself, and then contextualize the contents within this book as well, inshallah, and then we'll close up.
Well, the book is broken down into three categories. It has an Ilahiyat section, which is metaphysics, where he deals with principles of metaphysics. He has a section on ṭabʿiyāt, which is physics, and that is probably one of, it's perhaps most famous for that section. And it has a section on logic. Now, the first two, different scholars often commented on just one section. And that could be because that was the section they were teaching. And so sometimes, what would happen is that when you study Hidāyat al-Ḥikmah with one commentary, you would just be reading that one section with that commentary. You'd use another commentary for the other section, etc. So, as you mentioned, it is based upon, generally speaking, Masha'i principles. It has all of the main positions that you would expect to find in a book of medieval philosophy. Ibtal juz alladhi la yatajazza, I think, is the first one, if I remember, where it's negating the fact that the world is made up of atoms, rather affirming the fact that there is an absolute infinite sort of regress ad infinitum, so to speak, without beginning. All of those principles are there. One of the reasons why it achieves such great acceptance is because he was able to summarize all of the main masail in a very small text. And so now that is, I've said this before, I think in one of our earlier podcasts, that when teaching a book that's more wordy, it's less enjoyable for the teacher, you would assume, but the author's doing more work for you. So you have to comment less. It's the opposite. It's too wordy. So whereas the matan being small and concise allows for the teacher to then develop and to talk and to etc. So it's historically been there. It's achieved many famous commentaries. It's been taught in all of the great madrasas around the world. The Ottomans have loved it and taught it, and it has its own Ottoman commentaries on it. The Safavid have loved it, taught it, commented on it. Mullah Sadra, as an example. The Farangī Maḥallīs have loved it, taught it, commented on it. So it's one of those universal books, as too is the Isagoji.
That's right. And obviously, because it's Hikmat Nazariya, which is being taught, which is theoretical philosophy, they normally would have logic in there, they would have Riyadiyat in there, and they would also have
Ilm al-Hayat and everything.
ṭabʿiyāt and also ilahiyat in there. So it would have been 4 subjects that would have been taught. They removed logic from there because they wanted his Isagoji to be taught mainly, and that's the reason for it. And they also removed the Riyadiyah out of that section as well. So you're left with just the ṭabʿiyāt and the ilahiyat, which is the section of physics and metaphysics. And the physics section begins with abstract mental conceptions regarding the nature of reality. You have followed by mechanics, and then he has a discussion on meteorology, and then he concludes with organic matter. And each section has subsections as well. And then his metaphysics section has, he begins with abstract mental conceptions regarding the reality of existence, which is known as umur āmmah basically. And then he has followed by discussion concerning God and his attributes, and then he finally finishes on the intellect, so establishing the uqul. It has many commentaries, and there's too many to mention, but I think I'll just mention for as an abridgment, just the commentaries of the Farangī Maḥallī ulama on this work. First things first, the major commentaries, the famous commentaries are obviously Qazi Kamāluddin Mir Hussain ibn Mu'inuddin al-Maybūdī, who commentated on this work.
So Maybūdī is generally how it's known in the Western Academy, but in the subcontinent, just in case somebody gets confused, we normally say Mabzi.
That's right. And Al-Lari wrote a hashia on Mabzi, and so did Mullah Fannari as well. We both visited, alhamdulillah. He wrote, Mullah Sadra also wrote a commentary on the work, and we also have a commentary by al-Allāmah Abdul Haq Khairabādī as well, rahimahullah. As for the super commentaries on the work, there's quite a lot, but I'll just mention the super commentaries by the Farangī Maḥallīs. You have Mullah Hassan has a super commentary on the commentary of Hidāyat al-Ḥikmah of Mullah Sadra. Bahr al-Ulūm also has a hashia on Sharh Hidāyat al-Ḥikmah of Mullah Sadra. And Mullah Mu'in Farangī Maḥallīs also has a hashia on Sharh Hidāyat al-Ḥikmah. Mullah Nizamuddin Sihalwi also has a hashia on Sharh Hidāyat al-Ḥikmah of Mullah Sadra. And Mullah Waliullah also has a work called Hawashi, super commentaries on Sharh Hidāyat al-Ḥikmah by Mullah Sadra. So they really preferred Mullah Sadra's work, and they did also prefer Maybizi's work as well. Just to finish off, he has many other works, al-Allāmah Abharī writes. I think for the sake of closing today's session, I think at the least, let's just finish with that. What is the intent of the work? And you've already touched on that before. What would be the intent of this work?
Of logic or of his Hidāyat
of his Hidāyat al-Ḥikmah?
His intention of the work as a Muslim theologian was to list out the arguments of the philosopher. But in general, whatever the intention was of the Muslim philosopher was his intention.
Fantastic.
Yeah, whatever the mutakallim's intention is. What is your intention for studying it? What's the intention of someone teaching it? It is only to understand the historical record of medieval philosophy, to grow one's intelligence, to sharpen one's mind, and for them to be able to understand the principles of philosophy and be able to deal with it accordingly.
That's right. And also one of the other things as well is that just do keep in mind that the Hidāyat al-Ḥikmah is basically a simplified version of the philosophy of Ibn Sīnā, and it's intended for madrasa teaching use. Because remember, students are going to be studying Kalam. So many of the students who are already studying Kalam, those of them who are studying the Musāyarah, or they would have studied the ad-Dīn of Imām al-Aīji, or any other works in Kalam, they will be coming across a lot of terms. They'll be coming across words like makan, they'll be coming across words like jawhar, and all of these terms, all these juz la yatajazza, huyula, all these terms and concepts. Basically, Hidāyat al-Ḥikmah is your book on terms.
Yeah, it's your Isa Ghoji before Hikmah.
That's right, it's your Isa Ghoji before Hikmah. So if you're really a true student of Ilm al-Kalam, then you would definitely at least have studied.
Not just Ilm al-Kalam, this goes back to what I said in one of our earlier podcasts about mantiq. It's even if you don't like anything, you can't get through a tafsir without it.
That's right.
Why? You can't study usul al-fiqh without it.
Yeah.
You're going to get stuck on, right at the beginning, the discussion on mutlaq and muqayyad, and umum and khusus, and maqsus anhu al-ba'd. How are you going to understand all of that without mantiq?
It was their world as well, and I was reading just the other day, Allāmah Ibn Humām mentions and point, and then he says, كَمَا تَقُولُ الْفَلَاسِفَةُ فِي دَوْرَاتِ الْأَفْلَاق. Like, what is Dawrat al-Aflaq? Like, there's a whole section dedicated to Hidāyat al-Ḥikmah. So you're not going to even understand his examples.
Can I just end on this? Yeah. That if nothing else, there was no other benefit to you, as a Sunni I'm talking about, an Ash'ari Maturidi. Why? Because you've got your tradition. If there was no other reason for you to enjoy the terms of hikmah and mantiq, it is to be able to read your tradition.
That's right.
Like what you just said there, which is when you're reading a tafsir from 800 years ago, 500 years ago, and he uses a term. Imagine somebody reading tafsir and they don't know balagha. Don't you feel sorry for them? Because they're going to say that this is a particular type of isti'ara, and the miskin isn't going to know what that means.
That's
right. So can you benefit from that tafsir now? No, you can't benefit from it. Can you appreciate the subtlety of the Arabic language or of the verse of the Quran, which the Allāmah Mufassir is teaching you? No. Now, if you're saying, well, it's all useless anyway, you don't need any of that, in balagha of the Quran, and it's just whatever the teachings are to act upon it. That's what it's okay. That's your manhaj, no problem. But if you want to appreciate the asrar, the secrets of the Quran, and you want to appreciate its i'jaz, its miraculous nature, then you have to appreciate balagha. So in the same way, if you want to appreciate your heritage, you have to have the keys to unlock it. And all of these are part of the keys. So for no other reason, that's a good enough reason. But alhamdulillah, I think we're going to have to stop there. I think regretfully, this should have been a series more than a podcast. We've said this every single time we've done a podcast. We've said it should have been a series. And maybe in the future, if Allah Ta'ala gives us time, then it'll be nice to maybe really, open up all of these discussions. Because I think all of them needed a lot more time. And I think if people appreciate how much maybe we held back today, then make dua, inshallah. Maybe there will be a series. But again, it's just, alhamdulillah, this is the beauty of our tradition. It has wealth and breadth, and we're not even scratching the surface of it.
That's right.
Really. So may Allah Ta'ala reward the scholars of Islam. If I could just summarize right at the end there, that the position of Ahl Sunnah with this has always been in order to defend Islam. And for some of the scholars that have the capacity, the ability, and the correct understanding and sincerity, that studying hikmah was important in order for them to defend Islam. And that was its purpose, and alone its purpose. Otherwise, there's no dunyawi or worldly benefit to it. So alhamdulillah, we hope that we were able to defend the great scholars of Islam in their occupation with the science, and to show its importance, and inshallah its importance and relevance even today, even if some of the subjects would require further expansion or development, or all of that is from our tradition. May Allah give us strength to do so. We thank all of you, inshallah ta'ala, for tuning in to this podcast. And inshallah, hopefully, Allah Ta'ala give us life, then Allah give us the ability and sincerity to continue to have sessions and conversations like this, inshallah, where we open up about really important discussions within our Islamic intellectual heritage. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us tawfiq. Allah accept it from all of us. Barakallahu feekum. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
الحمد للمتوحد بجلاله المتفرد وصلاته